She told the cops I was trespassing on land she never bothered to understand. When HOA Karen called 911 to throw me out of my own lake cabin, I knew this wasn't a simple mistake. The quieter I stayed, the more they thought I was weak. But out here in Montana, silence carries truth. And the moment those old papers surfaced, the whole community finally saw who really owned this land. The lake was so still that morning it looked like someone had laid a pane of glass across the valley. A thin band of mist drifted low over the water, curling around the dock like it was reluctant to leave. I sat on my pine wood chair, the one I'd sanded and stained myself 15 summers ago, hands wrapped around a warm mug of black coffee. The air smelled of wet cedar, cold stone, and the faint sweetness of last night's rain drying on the cabin roof. Mornings like these were why I'd stayed. Mornings like these were the last place on earth I expected trouble to find me. But trouble came anyway. It arrived wearing a fitted navy blazer, pearl earrings, and an expression that could curdle milk. I heard the crunch of gravel before I saw her. Not the cautious step of someone approaching a stranger's home. No. This was the determined stomp of a person who believed the world owed her an explanation, and she planned to collect it in full. The woman marched up my wooden steps, heels clacking against the old boards that had held up just fine long before her HOA ever existed. She didn't knock. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't even pause long enough to glance at the view that made the entire region worth living in. She simply planted herself in front of my door, jabbed a finger in my direction, and barked the words that would rupture the peace of that morning. "You are trespassing. Step away from that porch right now, or I am calling the police." For a second, I honestly thought she was talking to someone behind me. I even turned my head, scanning the quiet stretch of shoreline, the rippleless lake, the distant pines leaning into the breeze. But no, she meant me. The man drinking coffee on the steps of his own cabin. The cabin my father had restored. The cabin I'd kept up for years, shingling the roof myself, replacing beams oak by oak. The cabin whose deed sat in a fireproof box under my bed. I set my coffee down on the railing, letting its warmth slip from my hands. Her face was flushed, anger, entitlement, maybe both. Her hair was gathered in a tight ponytail that pulled her features into sharper angles. The wind tugged at the hem of her blazer, but she held her stance rigid, as though the mere thought of softening would violate her personal code. "I'm Bethany," she said sharply, lifting her chin as if expecting applause. "President of the Clearwater Ridge HOA. I nodded slowly. I didn't say a word. Her eyes narrowed at my silence. "This property," she continued, tapping her clipboard with a manicured nail, "is part of our managed community space. You do not have permission to be here. Residents have complained about an unauthorized occupant in this cabin." I let the steam from my coffee rise between us. The air tasted metallic now, tension rolling in like a quiet storm. Somewhere down the lake I heard the hollow thunk of a boat rope hitting a wooden cleat. A goose honked once, startled by her volume. I finally spoke. "This is my cabin." The sentence was calm, simple, nothing more than fact. But Bethany reacted as if I'd insulted her entire bloodline. She yanked her phone from her pocket with a triumphant flourish. "That's enough. I'm calling 911. She didn't hesitate. She didn't question. She didn't ask for identification or history or explanation. She simply turned away slightly, pressed the screen, and spoke with the clipped confidence of someone who had never once been told no. "Hello, yes. This is an emergency. I have a trespasser at the community lake cabin. He's refusing to leave. Yes. I feel unsafe." Unsafe. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. A gust of wind pushed across the porch, carrying the scent of cold water and silt. My jaw tightened, but I didn't move. Years in this place had carved patience into my bones, even on mornings when someone tried to rewrite reality in front of me. While she paced, the boards creaked beneath her heels. She described me to the dispatcher like I was some kind of threat lurking on her property. "Mid-60s," she said, "sitting like he owns the place." That last part twisted something low in my chest, but I swallowed it. Anger wasted energy. And besides, anger didn't change the truth. A pickup truck rattled down the gravel road leading to the shore. Sheriff Marcus always drove with one arm resting on the open window, letting mountain air slap him awake better than any cup of diner coffee. His tires spat dust as he pulled up beside the path. A second deputy stepped out too, adjusting his belt as he scanned the scene. Bethany practically leapt toward them. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. He refuses to leave the community cabin. This is supposed to be accessible only through approved HOA scheduling." Marcus's eyes drifted from her reddened face to my calm one. He'd known me for years, shared coffee with me after long patrol nights, fixed his fishing rod at my workbench more than once. His expression was neutral, but the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth told me he already sensed something off. "Morning," he said, voice steady. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" I picked up my mug again, let its warmth soak through my fingers. "Morning, Marcus. I'm sitting at my cabin. She doesn't think I have the right to be here." Bethany jumped in. "This structure is owned by the community. Our documents clearly state." Marcus raised a hand gently, the way he'd calm an impatient rancher or a bickering pair of fishermen. "Ma'am, I'll take a look at the paperwork, but let me talk to him first." Her mouth snapped shut, but the fury radiating from her posture didn't dim. She stepped aside with stiff shoulders, as though the sheriff was inconveniencing her simply by doing his job. Marcus approached me, boots leaving faint prints in the pale dust on the wood. "You got ID? Any documents showing ownership?" "I do." "And you're choosing not to show them?" "Not yet." The deputy's brows lifted. Bethany made a strangled noise of outrage. But Marcus knew me well enough to hear what I didn't say. I wasn't withholding out of defiance. I was waiting, patiently, deliberately, because timing mattered when someone tried to push you off your own land. A breeze rippled across the lake then, scattering the mist and revealing the mirrored reflection of the tree line. The surface shimmered with gold as the first real light crept over the ridgeline. Bethany misinterpreted the momentary silence as victory. She crossed her arms, triumphant. "You see? He won't produce anything. I told you, trespassing. He probably thinks this is some abandoned shack anyone can stay in." Inside me, something cold tightened. Not anger exactly. Something quieter, older, more rooted. This land had history. My father's boots had walked these boards. My mother's hands had cooked in that tiny kitchen. Generations of work had sunk into the soil beneath us. And this woman, who hadn't lived here long enough to learn how the wind changed before a storm, thought she could erase all that with a clipboard and a loud voice. She didn't know the truth. She didn't know the law. She didn't know the boundaries of the lake or the deeply inconvenient fact that not everything in Clearwater Ridge fell under the HOA's shiny umbrella. She didn't know, but she was about to. I stood slowly, setting my mug aside. The pine boards groaned softly under my weight, as though the cabin itself were waking to the confrontation. Marcus straightened, sensing the shift. Bethany stepped back, one foot slipping on a patch of gravel. "What are you doing?" I looked at her for a long moment, not in anger, but in measured consideration. The wind stirred again, brushing cool air against the back of my neck. Across the lake, a red-tailed hawk circled, its shadow gliding silently over the water. Then I spoke, voice low but steady enough to cut through the tension thickening the air. "Tell me something, Bethany. What makes you so sure I don't belong here?" Her lips parted, indignation rising, but she didn't answer. Not immediately. Because for the first time that morning, she realized she had no idea who she was talking to or what land she was standing on. And that was the moment everything began to shift. Her lips parted, indignation rising, but she didn't answer. Not immediately. Because for the first time that morning, she realized she had no idea who she was talking to or what land she was standing on. And that was the moment everything began to shift. The breeze that swept across the lake carried a sharper edge now, as if the air itself sensed the imbalance tilting in a new direction. Bethany steadied her clipboard against her chest, fingers drumming along the polished metal clip. She drew a slow breath, tightened her jaw, and planted her heels more firmly into the aging wood planks of my porch, as if claiming the ground by sheer force of posture. The faint scent of paper, ink, and some citrusy perfume radiated off her in waves, sharp, intrusive, entirely out of place amid the cedar and lake water. "I'm sure," she finally said, voice thin but rising. "I am absolutely sure because I have documentation. This cabin is listed as community managed. The HOA has full oversight, including access rights. These structures," she waved an impatient hand at the logs, the beams, the porch, "were included in the Clearwater Ridge expansion plans. They're under our authority." I didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence often spoke louder, and my silence seemed to grate at her more deeply than any argument could have. Her lips tightened again, a small muscle beneath her left cheek twitching with irritation. She stepped closer, invading the foot of space between us with the confidence of someone used to winning, simply by speaking louder. "You can stare all you want, sir, but it won't change the facts. Residents have rules, property has boundaries, and you," she jabbed her pen toward the floorboards, "are violating both." Marcus cleared his throat from the yard below. Gravel shifted under his boots as he approached the steps, his wide-brim hat casting a shadow across his brow. "Bethany," he said steadily, "let's slow down. I'd like to see whatever maps or documents you've brought. We'll sort this out." She spun toward him, relief flooding her face as if he'd just chosen a side. "Yes, Sheriff, absolutely." She snapped open her clipboard and unfolded a trifold brochure, glossy and professionally printed. "This right here is the community layout, and this," she flipped to a laminated page, "is the recreational space map provided by the developer. You'll see the cabin listed under Lakeside Community Cabin A. Therefore, per regulations," the papers fluttered suddenly in a gust of wind, the lake's breath lifting a corner before pressing them back flat against her palm. She didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in her performance. I watched the sunlight catch the edges of the laminated sheet, bright enough to sting the eyes. But beneath that gloss lay something she didn't understand. A misunderstanding so deep, it bordered on fiction. Marcus took the papers and studied them quietly. His brows knit as he scanned the tiny print along the margins. "These are HOA planning documents," he said finally, returning them. "They don't show ownership, only intended use." Bethany's expression cracked for an instant, like a porcelain glaze hit by sudden cold, but she forced it back into place with stiff control. Intended use implies management. Management implies oversight, and oversight implies authority. You know that as well as I do. "I know what authority looks like," Marcus replied calmly. "And I know what overstepping looks like, too." The color rose in her cheeks again, deepening into a blotchy red. She pivoted toward the cluster of onlookers beginning to gather near the shore. A couple walking their dog, an older pair holding fishing rods, a woman in a sweatshirt standing beside her bike. Their murmurs drifted through the air like low chimes. "This man is trespassing," Bethany announced loudly enough for her voice to carry across the water. "Everyone needs to understand that. This cabin is community-owned. If we allow unauthorized individuals to occupy structures like this, then everything we've built, our safety, our order, falls apart." Order. That word struck the air like a thrown stone. I watched the ripples move across the faces of the people listening. Some nodded uncertainly. Others glanced at me with sympathy or curiosity. But all of them held a question in their eyes. What was really happening? I rose from my chair again, not abruptly, but slowly, letting the wood creak beneath me. The sound echoed lightly under the porch roof, reminding me again how old this place was, how well it had aged, how many storms it had weathered. I stepped down from the porch, boots pressing into soft soil where dew still clung to wild grass. As I descended, the scent of wet earth mingled with the crisp tang of lake air, grounding me deeper into the land that had been in my family long before any HOA bylaws were drafted. Bethany's composure wavered. She took an involuntary step back as though my presence alone threatened the bubble of control she had created. "Sir," she snapped, "do not come any closer. I am still within my rights to request your removal." "Your rights," I said quietly, "are what concern me most." She blinked. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I continued, brushing a pine needle from my sleeve, "you're operating under assumptions. Assumptions built on incomplete documents and second-hand information. You walked onto this porch certain of something you've never taken the time to verify." Her nostrils flared. "You are not a resident of Clearwater Ridge." "You're right," I said. "I'm not." A wave of murmurs rippled through the group behind her. Even Marcus looked at me with a flicker of surprise. Bethany seized the shift instantly. "You see?" she said triumphantly. "He admits it. This isn't his home. He doesn't belong here." I let her have her moment. She needed it. Sometimes people who believe they're in control cling hardest right before the ground gives way. I caught the faint reflection of sunlight glinting on the sheriff's badge and the dull shine on Bethany's clipboard. Everything gleamed except her certainty, which had begun to dull at the edges. "You're right," I said again, slowly. "I don't live in Clearwater Ridge. I don't pay HOA dues. I don't attend board meetings. I'm not under your jurisdiction." She lifted her chin victoriously. "Exactly. Therefore, but," I added, letting the word slide in like a stone altering the current of a river, "not being one of your residents doesn't make me a trespasser." The triumph on her face flickered. "It does if you're occupying community property." "That depends," I said softly, "on whose community you're talking about." The wind shifted. Pine branches rustled down the shoreline. A raven settled on a stump nearby, watching like some kind of quiet witness. Bethany tried to hold her confident stance, but her weight shifted unevenly from one heel to the other. "Sheriff," she said, voice tightening, "I insist you take action. Remove him from the cabin until this is sorted out." Marcus exhaled slowly. His gaze slid from her to me, measuring the tension, the uncertainty, the way the ground beneath this argument was becoming less stable by the second. "I'll take action," he said, "but I want to hear his side fully before I make a move." "You already have his side," she snapped. "He's refusing to leave. He won't show documents. He doesn't even live here." The deputy shifted uneasily. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate. I stepped to the side, letting the light catch the rough grain of the cabin logs behind me, weathered but solid. "Bethany," I said quietly, "you've come here with assumptions. You've made accusations. You've called the police to a property you don't own. So let me ask you something directly." She swallowed. "What?" "Why?" I asked. "Are you so sure this land belongs to you?" Her breath hitched ever so slightly, and for the first time since she'd stormed onto my porch, real doubt flickered behind her eyes. She looked back down at her clipboard, flipping pages, searching for validation in ink and laminate rather than in truth. Her fingers trembled. "Because," she began, voice faltering, "because this is Clearwater Ridge. Everything around this lake falls under our authority." "No," I said, voice steady as the lake behind us. "Not everything." She stared at me. confusion beginning to bloom into something sharper. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control. The dog walker murmured something to the woman beside him. The fisherman tightened his grip on his rod. The raven cawed once, cutting through the stillness. You think you know this place, I continued, but you don't. Not the history, not the landlines, not the deeds, not the rights that have been here longer than any HOA ever dreamed. Her face paled. What are you implying? That you should have checked, I said, before calling 911. The tension spiraled tighter, coiling around all of us like a drawn rope. A shoreline breeze rustled the reeds, whispering through the hollow spaces between them. Somewhere in the distance, a slate-colored cloud rolled across the mountains, though no rain threatened yet. Bethany's voice thinned to a brittle, desperate edge. Sheriff, remove him, now! Marcus didn't move. Instead, he turned toward me. Sir, he said quietly, I'll need to see whatever documents you have, whenever you're ready. I nodded once, but not today. Timing mattered, and the moment Bethany believed she had won was precisely the moment she had begun to lose everything she thought she controlled. I lifted my mug again, though it had cooled enough that the rim no longer warmed my hands. The air around us felt heavier, thicker, not with heat, but with that slow-building kind of tension that settles in before a storm rolls over the mountains. I stepped back onto the porch, the pine boards groaning softly beneath my boots, and returned to my chair. I let the silence stretch out, not indifference, but intention. Silence has weight. Silence, when used well, unnerves people far more than shouting ever could. Bethany did not appreciate silence. She stiffened the way someone does when a dog refuses to heel. You can't ignore this, she snapped, her voice ricocheting off the still surface of the lake. Sheriff, he's uncooperative. That alone proves... It proves nothing, Marcus interrupted gently. People get quiet when they're deciding their next move. Her glare sharpened, or hiding something. I rocked slightly in my chair, letting the sound of the creaking wood blend with the rhythmic lap of lake water against the dock. The sun had climbed higher, warming the tops of the pine trees and casting long, striped shadows across the water. A dragonfly hovered over the railing, pausing like it too was observing the confrontation. The world around us carried on, steady, quiet, patient, while Bethany fluttered and fumed like a misplaced gust of wind fighting the wrong direction. The deputy leaned close to Marcus, whispering something I couldn't hear. Marcus shook his head once firmly. Even he seemed to understand that pushing me right now would only escalate things, and escalation wasn't what I wanted. Not yet. Behind Bethany, more residents had gathered near the shoreline. Their expressions varied, some curious, some bored, others uneasy in a way only small-town folks get when they sense a boundary dispute brewing. Nothing stirs up fears like the thought of losing access to a pretty lake they'd been promised in a glossy brochure. Bethany turned toward them, searching for reinforcement. Everyone needs to understand, she announced, voice pitching higher than before, that this cabin cannot be used by unauthorized individuals. If we allow this man to stay here, we lose control over the entire lakefront. The HOA exists to protect property values, to maintain order, and we can't maintain order if order isn't the same as ownership, I said quietly. My voice wasn't raised, but the sound carried across the porch and echoed into the morning air. The simplicity of it cut her off sharper than any accusation. Even the dog on the trail downshore stopped to listen. Bethany pivoted toward me. Excuse me? You heard me, I said, keeping my tone even. You're confusing oversight with possession. They're not the same. Her lips thinned until they nearly disappeared. She tapped her clipboard against her side, a nervous rhythm she probably didn't realize she was making. Sheriff, she said firmly, this has gone on long enough. You need to remove him so we can re-establish proper management. This building is listed under our community inventory." "Inventory," I repeated softly, letting the word turn in the air like something brittle. "That's an interesting choice of phrasing." She ignored me and thrust the laminated map toward Marcus again. He eyed it with the same look he gave bad parking tickets, resigned, patient, mildly annoyed. "Bethany," he said, "this doesn't show who owns this land. It only shows the HOA's intended recreational layout." She huffed. "That's how communities work. The developer assigns areas and the HOA manages them. It's all part of the structure. This cabin has been used for community events for years. Fishing lessons, youth gatherings. Even last year's holiday banquet sign-ups were taken right inside this." She gestured vaguely at the porch, like the cabin itself might bow in respect. "And none of that changes the question," I replied. "Which is, who owns this?" Her cheeks flushed deeper. "Ownership," she spat, "is implied by usage." Marcus raised one eyebrow. "That's not how the law works." Bethany rounded on him. "Sheriff, you need to stop indulging this and start enforcing. This man is sitting on a property that's listed under our domain. If he won't present documents, then you need to remove him while we—" "You're not listening," Marcus said calmly, and even the deputy glanced at him in surprise. "I can't remove a man from a cabin without confirming whether or not he has the right to be here." She faltered again, another small crack along the surface of her confidence. I leaned back, letting my gaze drift over the lake. The water shimmered now, each ripple catching the light like shifting silver scales. The vastness of it, deep, ancient, unmoved by human quarrels, offered a strange comfort. This place had outlasted miners, settlers, loggers, surveyors, developers, and now, apparently, an HOA president with a laminated brochure and a penchant for authority. I brought the mug to my lips again, now lukewarm but steady in my hand. "You know," I said softly, "this lake was never part of any developer's original plan, not the land around it, not the water rights, not the cabin either." "That's a lie," Bethany snapped, desperation leaking into her tone. "Everything here belongs to Clearwater Ridge." "Everything you were told," I corrected, "belongs to Clearwater Ridge." She blinked, confusion flashing behind her eyes. The crowd behind her shifted, murmuring again. A fisherman scratched his beard thoughtfully. The woman with the bike leaned forward just a little, her ponytail brushing her shoulder as if she might hear something important. Even the raven that had perched earlier now hopped closer to the dock's edge, curious. "Ma'am," the dog walker called from the path, "I've lived here 9 years, and I always heard that the cabin was older than the subdivision." "It is," I said. Bethany whipped around toward him. "Rumors, old tales, nothing official." She was unraveling now, not loudly, not yet, but in those small, unmistakable ways power slips from someone who's held it too tightly for too long. A tremor in her grip, a rise in her shoulders, a crack in her voice's steady rhythm. I spoke gently, almost kindly. "What made you so sure this was yours?" Her jaw tightened. She looked down at her clipboard, searching for an anchor. Because it was always presented as part of our managed space." "Presented," I repeated softly. "Not proven." Marcus exhaled again, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He looked at me, then at her, then at the lake stretching behind us like a witness with perfect memory. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "until we see ownership records, I can't force him to leave." Bethany stared at him as though he'd betrayed not just her, but the entire concept of authority. She clenched her clipboard so tightly the plastic cover bowed inward. "You want records?" she asked sharply. "Fine, but so far, I'm the only one providing anything. He's offered nothing." I didn't answer. Instead, I simply stood, the chair rocking back gently before settling still. I took my mug and walked to the edge of the porch. My boots found the same grooves they'd found for years, the places the wood had shaped itself around my presence. The grain felt familiar beneath my soles. I looked out across the water, letting the memory of my father's voice drift back, the way he'd said, "Son, land reveals itself slowly, but people reveal themselves fast." Bethany had revealed plenty. Still facing the lake, I said quietly, "Not all proof is loud." The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine sap, cold stone, and the faint rust of old metal from the anchor hooks near the dock. Behind me, Bethany's breathing quickened. "Sheriff," she said sharply, "this situation is unacceptable. If you won't remove him, the HOA will pursue every action necessary to—" And then she stopped. Because even she knew deep down that her actions had awakened something she hadn't anticipated. Not defiance, not hostility, not resistance even, but certainty. The kind of certainty a man carries when he knows exactly where he stands and exactly what ground lies beneath his feet. I took one last sip from my mug and set it down gently on the railing, the ceramic clicking softly against the wood. The sound was small, but it echoed like a starting bell, because silence had played its role, and soon enough, truth would take the stage. I rose from the porch slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle into the wooden boards beneath my boots. The lake behind us shimmered under the strengthening sun, casting wavering reflections up against the underside of the deck, as if the water itself were waiting for what I was about to do. Bethany watched with attention so sharp it seemed to vibrate around her, chin tilted, shoulders drawn, clipboard tucked tight like a shield. The sheriff shifted his stance but didn't interfere. He knew me well enough to sense the turn coming before anyone else did. I stepped off the porch and walked toward my truck. Gravel crunched beneath my boots in soft, steady rhythms, each step unhurried, deliberate, echoing across the shoreline. The truck sat under the shade of an old lodgepole pine, its branches swaying gently, scattering needles across the hood in quiet green confetti. I opened the passenger door, the hinges creaking in a familiar way that spoke of years of use, not neglect. The scent of sun-warmed leather drifted out, mixed with pine sap and dust. Under the seat, wrapped in a canvas sleeve worn thin at the edges, lay the past. My family's past, the land's past. I pulled the bundle out carefully. Even the sheriff straightened a bit as he saw it in my hands. Bethany's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but a flicker of uncertainty betrayed her composure. I returned to the small clearing in front of the porch, the bundle tucked under my arm. The crowd's murmurs quieted as I approached, the air tightening like a drawn bowstring. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smell of wet earth, lake minerals, and distant smoke from someone's early morning wood stove. I stopped 3 paces from Marcus and unrolled the canvas. Inside lay papers, old ones, the edges browned with age, corners softened by decades of careful handling. Some were typed, others bore handwritten notes in ink faded to a dark sepia. The top sheet was a deed, its embossing still intact, though time had dulled its crispness. Marcus's eyes flicked to it immediately. Bethany, however, scoffed with theatrical disdain. "Oh, please," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Sheriff, this is ridiculous. We operate under current documentation, not—" She gestured vaguely at the papers, whatever relics he dug out of an attic. But I didn't look at her. I held the deed out to the sheriff. "Read the last line," I said quietly. Marcus took the paper gently, as though aware of its value. The crowd leaned closer. The breeze faded for a moment, leaving only silence and the soft lap-lap of water against the rocks. Bethany huffed. "This proves nothing. Anyone can print a fake deed." Marcus ignored her. His finger traced the bottom section, eyes narrowing as he reached the final line. His lips parted slightly, He exhaled. "Bethany," he said, "this isn't nothing." For the first time all morning, uncertainty crept fully onto her face. "What are you talking about?" Marcus lifted the document slightly. "This deed predates Clearwater Ridge by nearly 40 years. The boundaries listed here," he pointed at a faint ink outline, "cover the cabin, the shoreline, and the entire northern arc of the lake." "That's impossible," she snapped, voice cracking. "That land is managed by the HOA. It's always been that way. Everyone knows that." "Everyone," I said evenly, "was told that. There's a difference." The crowd shifted. A few exchanged glances. The dog walker stepped closer, squinting at the paper. A fisherman muttered under his breath. Even the raven on the dock seemed to hop forward, curious. I unrolled another sheet. A topographic survey from decades earlier, complete with compass bearings and a signature from an old surveyor whose family had lived in the region since the 1800s. The ink was faded, but legible. The seal, though weathered, remained intact. I held it toward Marcus. "This shows the original parcel lines, before the developer bought adjacent tracts, before the HOA existed, before Clearwater Ridge was even a name." Bethany stared at the documents as if they were snakes about to strike. "This is absurd. Nobody owns more than the developer recorded. All lakeside property is under HOA management. It's standard." "No," I said. "It's common, but not standard. There are exceptions." I pulled out the final page, a certified water rights record from the state. A crisp blue stamp sat in the corner. This one wasn't old. It was renewed every 10 years, and this version had my father's name and mine printed clearly. "This," I said, "is the most important one. Water rights to the northern half of Clearwater Lake, including intake access, maintenance, shoreline control, and cabin use, transferred directly from my father before he passed." Bethany's mouth fell open. She looked at Marcus, then at the papers, then at me. That can't be right," she whispered. "Nobody mentioned water rights during the community meetings. The developer didn't—" "Did you ask?" I interjected gently. Her eyes hardened. "I didn't need to ask." Marcus exhaled again, more heavily this time. "Bethany, you definitely needed to ask." She stood frozen, her authority crumbling by the second, clipboard trembling against her chest. Around her, the residents whispered louder now, fragments of doubt, questions, curiosity rippling through the group. I stepped closer, not threateningly, but firmly enough that she felt the weight of the truth pressing in. "You walked onto my porch this morning," I said slowly. "Certain you understood the rules, certain you had the right to enforce them. But you never stopped to consider one thing." She swallowed. "What?" "That this cabin is older than your HOA, older than your development, older than every glossy brochure you've ever handed out. And the rights tied to it weren't erased just because someone printed a new map." Her cheeks reddened with humiliation, or anger, hard to tell. She spun toward Marcus. "Sheriff, this doesn't change anything. Those documents don't override the developer's plans." "They override a lot," Marcus corrected, "especially when they're legally recorded and predating recent claims." "But we practically use this land," she insisted. "We host events. I raised an eyebrow. "You use it. You don't own it." The words hit like a quiet hammer. No force, just truth. Bethany took a shaky step back. The breeze rustled her blazer, lifting a strand of hair from her face. For a fleeting moment, she looked small beneath the towering pines, small in the shadow of a land she had assumed belonged to her domain. But then something in her hardened. "You think this proves anything?" she spat, recovering her brittle pride. "Fine. You have old papers. You have water rights. But the HOA has authority given by the community and by the developer's agreements. If you think I'm stepping aside because of a few dusty sheets, they're certified, Marcus said. She ignored him, leaning toward me instead. You're mistaken. I will challenge this. I will contact the board. I will get legal involved. You're not scaring me with paperwork. I met her gaze, calm, unflinching, unmoved. I'm not trying to scare you, I said softly. I'm trying to inform you. The crowd murmured again. Someone muttered, maybe we should have known about this. Another whispered, I heard rumors but never thought. Bethany's chest rose and fell in sharp, rapid breaths. Her grip on the clipboard whitened her knuckles. You're bluffing, she said desperately. Am I? I asked. I gestured toward the papers still in Marcus's hand, their edges fluttering lightly as the wind picked up. The lake's surface rippled with the breeze, sunlight splintering across it like scattered mirrors. Bethany stared at the documents as if hoping they might dissolve under scrutiny. They didn't. The truth had taken the stage, and nothing, not her voice, not her authority, not her indignation, could sweep it away. She took one final look at me, eyes burning with something deeper than frustration, fear, maybe, or disbelief, and then turned sharply on her heel. This isn't over, she said. She stalked away from the porch, each heel strike hitting the earth like a punctuation mark of denial. And as she walked, her shadow stretched long across land she never truly understood, land that had always told a different story. The moment she disappeared behind the line of pines, the crowd began to thin. Not because their curiosity had faded, but because a strange, uneasy quiet settled over them, like the air after lightning strikes, but before thunder announces itself. Even the lake seemed to pause, its surface holding still despite the soft push of wind drifting down from the ridge. I gathered the old documents and rolled them carefully back into their canvas sleeve, the paper crackling like brittle leaves. Marcus watched me do it, arms crossed loosely over his chest. The deputy stood nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, unsure whether to linger or return to the cruiser. You always did know how to pick your moments, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the faint rasp of an early morning that hadn't gone the way he expected. It wasn't my moment to pick, I replied. She made it for me. He huffed a quiet breath. Not quite amusement, not quite exasperation. Bethany isn't going to let this go. You know that. I do. You ready for what comes next? I slid the strap of the canvas sleeve over my shoulder, letting it hang securely at my side. I've been ready for years. That made him pause. A man like Marcus understood the weight of certain words. He understood the patience required to wait out storms, or the resolve needed to create one. The dog walker at the shoreline tugged lightly on his leash, murmuring to the golden retriever, who kept glancing nervously toward the cabin. The fisherman reeled in his line and shrugged when his wife whispered something to him. A teenage girl on a mountain bike frowned thoughtfully and took one last look at the cabin before pedaling away. One by one, they drifted off, carrying pieces of the morning's revelation with them, like seeds caught on their clothes, bound to take root somewhere. But their silence wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Something they'd believed about this lake, its story, its borders, its ownership, had cracked. And once a crack forms, light tends to pour in. I returned to the porch and lowered myself slow into the pine wood chair. The groan it gave felt like an old friend whispering welcome. The sun had risen high enough to warm the top railing, its heat seeping into my palms as I leaned forward and braced my hands against it. The lake glimmered in widening circles of gold. Ripples moved across its surface like thin ribbons, tracing the path of a breeze that carried the scent of damp moss and distant wildfire smoke, a reminder that even in a place as quiet as Clearwater, nature always wrote the larger story. My thoughts drifted, not toward anger, but toward the years that had shaped this valley. My father's hands hauling beams up the ridge, My mother's soft humming in the cabin kitchen, the long afternoons spent sanding the porch, the nights spent patching the roof while listening to wolves howl from the tree line. This cabin wasn't a structure. It was a lineage carved from wood and land and memory. And for a long time, no one questioned that. Until Clearwater Ridge arrived with brochures and bylaws and the belief that paper could overwrite history. I heard footsteps approach. Light, tentative ones, not the hard clack of Bethany's heels. When I glanced up, a man in a flannel jacket stood at the bottom of the steps. His face was familiar, though his name escaped me. He lived in one of the newer homes, near the trail that wound toward the southern shore. "Sir," he said gently, "I just wanted to ask, is it true? About the deed?" "It's true." He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the porch and the cabin as though seeing them for the first time, seeing them as something older and deeper than the community newsletters described. "My wife and I always wondered," he murmured. "The cabin looked different from the rest." "It is different," I said, "because it came before the rest." He nodded again, seeming to absorb it. "Well," he said after a moment, "I guess not everything in this valley is as simple as the HOA wants it to be." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, I think she overstepped today." I gave him a gentle half-smile. "She steps the same way every day. Today, she just picked the wrong porch." He chuckled under his breath, an uneasy but honest laugh, then raised a hand in farewell before walking back down the gravel path toward the manicured streets of Clearwater Ridge. The sun climbed higher, warming the shingles of the cabin roof and filling the valley with a bright, open light. I stood and walked down to the shoreline, boots leaving indentations in the damp soil. The lake lapped lazily at the stones, drawing lines that receded and reformed with each small wave. I knelt and dipped my fingers into the water. It was cold, glacial cold, the kind that prickled the skin and carried a clarity city taps could never imitate. My father always said you could taste a place in its water. Clearwater tasted of pine, granite, and a patience older than any deed. This place remembered everything, even if people forgot. Behind me, the sheriff finally approached. He stood beside me without speaking for a moment, then cleared his throat softly. "She's already making calls," he said. "I know. She's going to tell the board you forged something. She's welcome to try." "You planning to show her the rest?" he asked, tilting his head toward the canvas sleeve. "Not yet." He gave me a sideways look. "You always did like making folks underestimate you. People reveal who they are faster when they think they've already won." He let out another low breath, nodding in reluctant agreement. Then he rested a hand on my shoulder, a weight that was both warning and reassurance. "Just be careful," he said. "Bethany doesn't lose gracefully." I stood and brushed the dirt from my palms. "She hasn't lost yet." His eyes flicked toward the documents I carried. "I think she has. She just doesn't know it." He headed back to his cruiser. As the engine rumbled to life and rolled away, the quiet returned again. Birds sang intermittently from the treetops. The water glimmered, and the pines swayed with a secret they'd held longer than any blueprint. By midday, the land felt different, not physically. Nothing moved, nothing bent or broke, but the energy shifted, like a taut string plucked just once, vibrating with a resonance that hummed through unseen spaces. Word had begun to spread. I saw neighbors whispering as they walked the road. Saw curtains shift in cabin windows. Saw cyclists slow as they approached the lake, gaze drifting between the water and my porch. The truth had begun its slow, inevitable crawl across Clearwater Ridge, and truth, once set in motion, does not stop. But as I watched the shadows stretch across the land, I also saw something else. a cluster of new footprints on the trail, fresh tire marks near the footbridge, and a line of cones placed across the far end of the path leading toward the public dock. Bright orange cones, HOA cones. Bethany had returned to the field, not with understanding, but with retaliation. And that was when I knew the real conflict had begun. The first sign was the cones, bright, plastic, aggressively orange, lined up like sentries across the footpath that led from the main road to the public dock. They clashed violently with the natural colors of the valley. The muted sagebrush, the pale gray stones, the deep greens of the towering pines. They looked like dropped pieces of a construction zone that didn't belong in Montana, let alone on the shores of Clearwater Lake. The second sign was the new metal sign staked directly into the soil. Community Lake access closed until further notice. HOA authority. Violators subject to fines. The third sign, the one that really told me she was escalating, was the wooden barrier she'd ordered her volunteers to drag across the trail. I recognized the lumber. It came from the HOA storage shed. Pale, straight, knotless pine that hadn't yet seen a single winter storm. They'd hammered it into the ground just enough to make a point, not enough to make it stable. It leaned awkwardly, like even the wood disagreed with what it had been forced into. I stood at the edge of the trail for a long moment, letting the morning sunlight warm the top of my shoulders. The air carried the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke from a cabin chimney further down the ridge. Behind me, the lake moved lazily, disturbed only by the occasional dip of a trout breaking the surface. Then a door slammed. Bethany appeared from behind the HOA community shed, her heels clicking sharp staccatos on the paved path. She had swapped her earlier blazer for something even more rigid-looking, a tailored charcoal jacket with pronounced shoulders, as if she meant to physically widen her presence. 2 HOA volunteers followed her. One carried a stack of caution tape, the other lugged a bucket of metal stakes. Both looked nervous in that way people do when they realize they're participating in something they don't fully understand. Bethany spotted me immediately. She pursed her lips, squared her shoulders, and marched forward with the confidence of someone who mistook determination for righteousness. "Sir," she called out, her voice clipped and bright with artificial authority, "you are not permitted to stand on this trail at the moment. It is under temporary review." I looked down at my boots, planted firmly on the dusty earth. "This trail?" "Yes," she said. "This entire section, in fact." "Strange," I murmured, "because this trail isn't on the HOA maps you showed the sheriff earlier." Her jaw tightened. "We have extended jurisdiction during disputes." "That's so." "It is," she snapped, "and until we determine the legal boundaries surrounding this lake, you are not allowed to trespass on community-managed land." I let the breeze carry a slow breath out of me before speaking. "Bethany, this isn't community land. You've simply been using it." "That's not how usage works," she said sharply. "Long-term patterns establish expectations. Expectations establish rights." "You're describing habits," I corrected gently, "not law." The volunteer with the caution tape shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am," he murmured, "are we sure we're supposed to block the whole trail? Folks use it every—" Bethany shot him a glare so sharp it practically sliced the air. "We are maintaining order," she said, enunciating each word as though speaking to someone hard of hearing. "And order requires decisive action." Decisive action, apparently, now included choking off access to the lake. She turned her attention back to me, pointing her clipboard like a weapon. "You are interfering with HOA operations. That alone is a violation." "I'm standing," I replied. "On dirt." "On restricted dirt," she corrected. I almost smiled. The deputy sheriff's cruiser appeared in the distance, rolling down the gravel path with its familiar rumble. The sight made Bethany puff up like a bird preparing for a territorial fight. "He'll confirm everything," she said confidently. and you will be escorted off this land while we sort matters out." The cruiser parked, and Deputy Nolan stepped out. Not Marcus. Nolan was younger, earnest, and tended to follow rules with a kind of rigid enthusiasm that made him a favorite of the HOA. Bethany greeted him with open relief. "Deputy, perfect timing. This man is once again hindering community management efforts." Nolan adjusted his belt. "Sir, the HOA says—" "Deputy," I cut in gently, "do you personally know who owns this stretch of land?" He blinked. "Well, the HOA manages it." "That's not the question I asked." I watched him hesitate, not out of defiance, but uncertainty. He glanced at the cones, the signs, the barrier, then at me, then at the canvas sleeve strapped over my shoulder. The weight of the morning hung heavy between us, thickening like rising fog. "The sheriff," I continued, "saw the documents. Did he tell you what they showed?" Nolan shook his head. "He just told me to monitor things until he returns." "I see." Bethany stepped between us, heels digging into the dirt. "Deputy, I need you to enforce restricted access. This individual refuses to comply with HOA directives. He presents falsified documents, attempts to challenge community authority, and—" "You always did enjoy the sound of your own voice," I said, not unkindly, just plainly. She flinched, not at the words, but at the tone. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't argued, hadn't matched her fire. That unnerved her more than open confrontation ever could. "You can't speak to me like that," she sputtered. "I'm not speaking to your title," I said. "I'm speaking to your choices." Her breath hitched. A crack formed, not visible to the eye, but audible in the tremble that crept into her voice. "You're trying to embarrass me," she accused. "No," I answered quietly. "You're doing that on your own." The lake wind picked up, fluttering the edges of the caution tape still rolled in the volunteers' hands. The smell of water and sun-warmed pine filled the air. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, a sharp, slicing note. The moment stretched. Then Bethany snapped. "If you refuse to comply," she said, voice sharp with tightly coiled fury, "we will escalate this legally. We will pursue injunctions. We will petition the county. And we will assert our jurisdiction over this lake." I nodded once. "Good." She blinked. "Good?" "Because then," I said, "you'll have to prove what you claim." Deputy Nolan swallowed hard. Bethany sputtered. "Prove? We don't need to prove." "You do," I said. "And when you try, you'll learn the same thing the sheriff did. That this land, this shoreline, this cabin, and this trail were never yours to begin with." Wind rustled the cones, knocking one slightly off its base. Bethany stared at me, expression shattering into a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're bluffing again." I stepped past her, not brushing against her, not challenging her physically, simply walking the trail I had walked since childhood. The soil gave softly beneath my boots, familiar, welcome, unthreatened. "No," I said. "I'm waiting." "For what?" she demanded. "For you," I answered, "to make your next mistake." The words hung in the air like smoke. She turned away sharply and barked new orders at her volunteers. "Block everything, no lake access without my express approval, tape the entire trail, put up secondary signs, and call an emergency board meeting. This ends today." But it wouldn't end today, because she had just crossed a line she didn't know existed. And in doing so, she had stepped even deeper onto land that never belonged to her. Not in maps, not in law, not in truth. Not even in the story this valley told every morning when the lake opened its eyes to the rising sun. The cones, the barricades, the slapped-together signs, Bethany's little empire of plastic and plywood, glowed harshly in the late afternoon light. Their colors jarred against the warm tones of the valley, like foreign objects dropped on sacred ground. The trail, once an open ribbon of earth winding through the pines, now looked like a scene of petty occupation. a place seized not by authority, but by insecurity. I stood still and watched her pace in quick, jerking strides, issuing orders with the clipped fury of someone fighting shadows. Her volunteers were growing uneasy, the way their eyes darted, the awkward way they handled the stakes and tape. The whispers passed between them like wind through dry grass. Even the cones seemed to lean away from her, as if refusing to stand too close. Then I made a single call. 1 minute later, the world shifted. It began with a distant rumble rolling down the ridge, a low, throaty sound that didn't belong to the wind or the lake or anything born of the valley. Gravel on the main road crackled. Birds lifted off branches in startled flutters. A fine layer of dust puffed upward from the bend just beyond the old cedar grove. Bethany paused mid-instruction, head snapping toward the noise. "What now?" she snapped, irritation sharpening every syllable. The rumble grew louder, clearer, more distinct. A dark SUV appeared through the trees, sleek, dust-kissed, moving with steady confidence. Sunlight glared off its windshield, momentarily turning it into a flash of white fire. It rolled down the gravel path with purpose, its tires grinding over the stones, throwing up a faint trail of swirling dust that hung in the air like smoke. The HOA volunteers stepped back. Deputy Nolan straightened. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The SUV slowed, then stopped with a decisive crunch of gravel not 10 feet from Bethany's barricade. The engine cut. Silence dropped heavy. Bethany squared her shoulders. "Who is this?" she demanded under her breath, though the tremor in her voice betrayed something she didn't want to feel. Hesitation. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Sarah Keller. Boots first, dark leather, dust on the toes, the kind of boots worn by someone who walked courts, fields, and back roads with equal ease. She swung one leg out, then the other, rising from the SUV with calm authority. She wore dark jeans, a white shirt, and a slate-gray jacket that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Her sunglasses reflected the entire valley, the cones, the signs, Bethany's rigid posture, like a silent judgment from the land itself. She shut the SUV door with a solid, satisfying thud, not loud, just final. The kind of sound that said the real conversation was about to begin. Bethany stepped forward, puffing herself up. "This is restricted HOA space," she said sharply. "You can't just drive in here." Sarah removed her sunglasses slowly, hooking them into her collar. Her eyes, sharp, steady, unhurried, landed on Bethany with the kind of directness capable of halting a wildfire. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "I'm going to need you to stop talking." Bethany froze, mouth half open. Then, "Excuse me? You can't tell me?" "I can," Sarah replied. "And I just did." The valley went still. Deputy Nolan blinked, visibly unsure whose side he belonged on. I stepped forward, the dirt shifting softly beneath my boots. Sarah caught my eye and gave the faintest nod. She was already reading the terrain, the cones, the barricade, the volunteers, the deputy, the tension thick as dust in late summer. She'd always been exceptional at that. One glance and she understood the entire board. "Thank you for coming," I said. "Was already halfway here when you called," she answered. "Figured you'd need this." From the passenger side of the SUV, she retrieved a large, flat binder, weatherproof, heavy, stuffed with papers so neatly arranged, it might as well have been a weapon forged from bureaucracy itself. It clicked as she opened it, the sound echoing across the trail. Bethany's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Sarah didn't look at her. Not yet. "It's what you should have checked before placing barricades on someone else's land," she said. Now Bethany flinched, just slightly, but enough. Sarah walked toward the group, boots pressing into the soil with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly where she stood and why she couldn't be moved. She laid the binder on the hood of her SUV, flipping through color-coded tabs, pages rustling like the turning of seasons. State zoning revisions, she said, tapping one page. County easements, updated land surveys, maintenance access records, expired HOA permits for utilities crossing private land. She lifted her gaze to Bethany, meeting her eyes head-on. Expired, Sarah repeated slowly. Last year. Bethany's throat bobbed as she swallowed. That's not possible. We renewed everything. No, Sarah corrected. You didn't. You filed intent to renew. That isn't renewal. Your application was rejected because you failed to include a maintenance impact report. She paused. Twice. Nolan's head whipped toward Bethany. Twice? No, that's incorrect, Bethany sputtered. Our board always… Ma'am, Sarah cut in, her tone firm but level. Your board didn't read the updated county code. It changed 18 months ago. You missed it. What county code? Bethany demanded. Sarah turned the binder so everyone could see. The document on display bore a fresh county seal, dated only 6 months prior. This one, Sarah said, which clearly states that any easement crossing private land must be periodically renewed with the landowner's verification. She paused again. You never contacted the landowner? Bethany blinked rapidly. Because we didn't have to. Sarah smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. Yes, she said. You did. The breeze picked up, riffling the edges of the papers like fluttering wings. Then Sarah tapped the final page. And this, she said, is the part you should have paid attention to. She lifted the page from the binder and handed it directly to Deputy Nolan. He read the first few lines, and his face drained of color. This shows the entire northern shoreline easement belongs to him, he said, gesturing toward me. Not the HOA. Correct, Sarah said. And the permits the HOA used are, well, they're invalid on this side of the lake. Correct again. Nolan cleared his throat, suddenly cautious. So all of this, the barricades, the signs, the cones… Sarah closed the binder with a deliberate, echoing snap. Illegal, she finished. Bethany staggered back one step, boots sliding in loose dust. No, she whispered. No, that can't be right. We've maintained these trails for years. We've hosted events. We have community rights. Community use, Sarah corrected sharply, is not community ownership, and it certainly isn't community authority. Her words carved through the valley like cold wind through winter pine. Sarah turned to me. Sheriff Marcus will be here soon. He asked me to deliver everything directly. He's reviewing the rest with the county office. Bethany's breath hitched. You called the county? No, Sarah said. They called us. Bethany's clipboard slipped from her grasp and hit the dirt with a dull thud. No one moved to pick it up, not even her volunteers. Sarah stepped closer, not towering, not threatening, simply present in the way a mountain is present, steady, immovable, older than any map. You had every chance, she said softly, to verify the truth before escalating. You didn't, and now your entire case rests on assumptions instead of records. Bethany stared down at the fallen clipboard, chest rising and falling like someone trying to breathe through a snowfall. And one more thing, Sarah added. Your HOA's authority ends exactly. She pointed to a faint line in the dirt where old survey stakes once stood. Here. You're lying, Bethany whispered, voice strained. No, Sarah replied quietly. I'm the one who actually reads the law. Her words settled in the valley the way snow settles on branches. Soft, quiet, undeniable. And for the first time since sunrise, the land itself seemed to exhale. The wind eased. The lake, which had been trembling under the commotion of raised voices and shifting authority, flattened itself into a glassy sheen. Even the birds quieted, as though the entire valley paused to absorb what had just happened. Sarah's binder clicked shut, echoing through the air like the final note of a long, hard song. Nothing more needed to be said. Bethany didn't move. Not at first. She stood exactly where the weight of Sarah's words had struck her, fingers curled stiffly around her clipboard that still lay in the dirt where she'd dropped it earlier. The dust around her shoes danced in tiny spirals as the last remnants of wind drifted through. Her eyes were fixed not on Sarah, not on me, but on a point somewhere far beyond the pines, as though she were searching for a reality where this wasn't happening. But there was no such place, because the land doesn't lie, and neither do the papers that define it. The HOA volunteers, unsure what to do, hovered in a loose semicircle near the cones. Their faces had changed. Gone were the eager, obedient expressions they wore earlier, when they followed Bethany's instructions with unquestioned loyalty. Now they looked around with hollow discomfort, shifting on their feet, eyes lowered as though afraid to make eye contact with anyone. One man removed the caution tape from his hands slowly, folding it with an awkwardness that revealed more guilt than regret. Another nudged one of the cones with his toe, watching it wobble and settle lopsided in the dirt. Only Deputy Nolan remained where he stood, but even he looked smaller somehow, chastened by the revelation he'd been unaware of. "Let's clear a path," he muttered to the volunteers, but no one moved. Not until Sarah gave a short nod in his direction, a quiet signal that the legal stage had closed. Then, reluctantly, they began removing the cones, gathering them with hesitant hands, as though touching them now carried a weight they hadn't anticipated. I stepped a few paces back from the group and let the quiet settle over me like a blanket. The sun had dropped lower behind the ridge, bathing the valley in a soft amber glow that turned the lake into a sheet of molten gold. My shadow stretched long behind me, merging with the shadows of the pines. This silence was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not the confrontation, not the escalation, not even the unveiling of truth. This moment, the moment when nature reclaimed its voice and people were forced to listen to it, because the land always speaks last. Sarah approached me, her footsteps soft on the trail. "Told you she'd pushed the wrong direction," she murmured. "She pushed a lot of directions," I replied, watching Bethany still frozen in her place. "This is just the first one that pushed back." Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against her SUV. "She'll need time to process it." "She'll need more than time." A faint breeze carried the smell of lake water and sun-warmed pine sap. It drifted across the dried dirt, lifting the edges of a small pile of leaves by the barricade. One leaf tumbled loose, skittering across the ground until it landed near Bethany's boots. She glanced down at it sharply, almost flinching, as if even nature was mocking her. Deputy Nolan cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we should remove the signage until further review." Bethany didn't answer. He tried again, gentler. "Bethany, you should pick up your clipboard." Still nothing. Her silence wasn't calm or thoughtful. It was stunned. The silence of someone who'd built certainty on sand and only now discovered the tide's schedule. I turned away from the scene, my boots crunching softly over the gravel as I walked back toward my cabin. Each step felt heavier, not with exhaustion, but with the slow release of tension that had wound through the valley all morning. The pines rustled softly overhead as I passed beneath them, their branches shading the path with shifting patterns of gold and green. When I reached the cabin porch, I paused at the first step and looked back. Sarah was speaking quietly with Nolan. The volunteers stood uncertainly near the trailhead, no longer sure who to follow or what to believe. The barricade had already been dismantled, leaning like discarded lumber beside a pile of cones. The caution tape fluttered weakly from a stump where one end still clung. And there, at the center of it all, Bethany stood alone. Small, deflated, confused. The land around her, the land she'd tried to claim through laminated maps and aggressive certainty, now framed her like a witness. The soft sway of grasses, the murmur of the lake, the golden haze of sinking light, all of it surrounded her quietly, without judgment, without anger, simply existing in a truth older than any HOA document. This silence wasn't for victory. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath me with a familiar creak. The smell of pine resin rose from the beams as the sun warmed them. I reached my chair and lowered myself into it, the seat molding to my weight like an old friend. From here, the whole valley stretched out before me, the lake reflecting the sky, the trees moving like slow dancers in a soft breeze, the shadows stretching long across the open terrain. I let out a long breath, steady, controlled, and felt the weight of the morning lift gradually from my shoulders. The canvas sleeve with the deeds and surveys rested by my feet. Its presence wasn't triumphant. It wasn't a weapon. It was simply the truth. Quiet, patient, immovable, just like the land. Sarah gave me a small wave before getting into her SUV. Tires crunched over gravel as she drove away, raising a thin veil of dust that shimmered in the dying light. When her vehicle disappeared around the bend, the valley grew even quieter, as if the world were settling back into place after being shaken loose. Slowly, the residents dispersed. Some paused to glance my way. Some nodded faintly. Others looked uncertain, their morning assumptions shattered. But none approached Bethany. None offered comfort. None followed her. She lingered a while longer, clutching her clipboard again, though she held it differently now, against her chest, not as a badge of authority, but like armor she no longer believed in. Then she turned and walked slowly back toward Clearwater Ridge, her steps no longer sharp or commanding. Dust rose around her ankles, catching the amber light in soft clouds. The pines closed behind her like curtains closing at the end of a scene. I watched until she disappeared from view. The sun dipped lower. The valley deepened in color. Shadows thickened. The lake rippled gently with the first hints of evening wind. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes follow the slow dance of golden reflections across the water. The storm had passed, but the quiet afterward, the weighty, meaningful, waiting quiet, told me something unmistakable. Bethany wasn't done. And silence, though powerful, is never the end of a conflict. It's only the breath before the next wind comes. That wind arrived before dawn the next morning, cold enough to sting the back of my throat as I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee that hadn't yet warmed my hands. The lake was still, a sheet of glass stretching toward the far tree line, its surface untouched by even a whisper of breeze. It was the kind of morning that usually brought peace, where the world held its breath long enough for a man to believe that whatever storms he'd weathered might be drifting away for good. But there was something in the air, an unease, faint but certain, like the lake itself sensed what was coming. I heard the tires before I saw the car, slow at first, then crunching over the gravel in a way that didn't match the rhythm of any neighbor's truck or county vehicle I knew. It stopped near the bend in the trail where the pines leaned in close, their shadows long and blue in the early light. A figure stepped out, stiff-backed, formal, a courier, envelopes tucked under one arm. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed the corners of the stack, and made his way toward my porch with that polite, practiced caution people use when they're delivering something they know won't be welcomed. "Mr. Dalton?" he asked, voice steady. I nodded, setting my mug on the rail. He extended a thick yellow packet sealed with bright ink, the kind reserved for urgent matters. I didn't take it right away. I let it hang there between us for a beat, the weight of it almost visible. "It requires acknowledgement," he said quietly. I signed the small digital pad he offered and finally accepted the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, thick with documents, tabs, signatures, and the unmistakable sour smell of legal trouble that someone hoped would knock me off balance. The courier left quickly, almost relieved to be heading back to his car. I didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, I walked to the wooden bench facing the lake, the boards cool beneath me as the first fingers of sunlight reached over the mountains. The packet sat in my lap like an unwelcome guest, its corners pressing against my palms. For a long moment, I just watched the steam lift from my coffee, swirling in thin ribbons before disappearing into the morning air. Then, slowly, I tore the seal. The first page told me everything. Emergency petition for injunction, filed by Bethany Crowley, president of Maple Ridge HOA. Claims: harassment, unauthorized construction, community endangerment, illegal obstruction of shared resources, trespass upon common property, and at the bottom, in bold print, request for immediate court action. My jaw tightened, not out of anger would have been easy, but out of something deeper, older. A recognition that when someone like Bethany began to lose their grip, they often chose escalation over truth. She wasn't folding. She wasn't reflecting. She was doubling down, reaching for whatever thread of authority she had left and trying to wrap it around my neck. I flipped through the pages, the paper rasping against itself in sharp, unforgiving sounds. There were maps, doctored ones, signatures, some suspiciously neat, others dated incorrectly, and emails printed out in which she claimed I had threatened residents, sabotaged HOA operations, and methodically destabilized community morale. One message even suggested I had exerted psychological control over uninvolved citizens, a phrase so absurd I breathed a humorless laugh into the cold air. But beneath the exaggerations lay something more dangerous: fabrication. Official stamps placed on the wrong lines. A zoning chart cut and pasted into a format no city clerk would ever approve. It wasn't just sloppy, it was desperate. And desperation has a way of tearing truth apart piece by crooked piece. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. Heavy ones, measured. The kind belonging to a man used to wearing a badge and the responsibility that came with it. Sheriff Marcus emerged from the trees, his face half-shadowed by the brim of his hat, eyes scanning me first, then the papers in my hands. "You got one too?" he asked. I lifted the envelope in silent confirmation. He exhaled, long and low, before dropping onto the bench beside me. His coat creaked as he sat, the scent of pine and dust clinging to the fabric. "She filed hers with the county just after midnight," he said. "Came in loud, waving binders, insisting on emergency action. Clerks called me before sunrise asking whether you were unstable or dangerous. I told them no." He paused, rubbing his thumb along his jaw. But she didn't stop there. I waited. "She's reached out to a state-level office, some regulatory division that doesn't even oversee lakes or land surveys. Sent them copies of this mess." He tapped the packet. "Claimed the sheriff's department was compromised because I didn't evict you on her command." I stared at the water. It reflected the sky in perfect stillness, but beneath that glassy surface lay depth, currents, something alive and unbothered by noise at the shore. "She's trying everything," Marcus murmured. "Throwing nets into waters she doesn't understand." "She's afraid," I said softly. He nodded. "And dangerous people get more dangerous when they're afraid." A gust of wind drifted through, rippling the lake's surface. A pair of geese stirred near the reeds, wings shuffling. The world moved gently, but something in my chest tightened with the knowledge that this wasn't over. Far from it. I stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. Thank you for telling me, I said. Marcus arched a brow. What are you going to do? I folded the papers neatly, tucking them back into the envelope. What I've done since the beginning, I answered. Let the truth handle what they've built on lies. He hesitated, then nodded, rising to his feet. County review begins tomorrow morning, he said. Judge will want statements and proof. I have plenty of both. He studied me a moment longer, then tipped his hat and made his way back toward the trail, his figure shrinking between the tall pines until he vanished into the thinning dawn light. I remained where I was for a long time after he left. The envelope lay beside me on the bench, its presence steady, unavoidable. But inside me, something else stirred. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. This was no longer a dispute about a cabin or a lake, or a woman with too much authority and too little patience. This had become a battle of narratives, where truth and deceit fought for the same ground, and only one would remain when the dust settled. And I knew something Bethany had never bothered to consider. Paper tells the truth in the end, even when people don't want it to. By mid-afternoon, sunlight spilled across the valley in warm bands, melting the chill that had clung to the morning. But the warmth didn't soften the feeling that the land itself was bracing, waiting for the next ripple of trouble to reach the shore. I spent the day gathering every document, every survey, every deed I had, spreading them across my kitchen table in careful rows. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the combination grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For hours, I combed through each page, marking dates, highlighting signatures, reviewing maps with the slow patience of a man who had nothing to hide and no reason to rush. And as the sun lowered behind the mountains, casting gold through the window panes, I realized something else. Bethany's lies were loud, tangled, frantic. Mine was simple truth, and truth has a way of standing up straight even when someone tries to bend it. When night finally settled across the valley, I stepped out onto the porch once more. The lake, now dark and reflective, held the glow of the moon in its steady surface. A calm place, a wise place. And though trouble circled somewhere beyond the tree line, I felt steady, because storms built on lies collapse under their own weight. All I had to do was be ready when this one finally broke. I took a breath of cold night air, tasting pine and the faint sweetness of lake mist. Somewhere in the distance, a single owl called out, a low, resonant note that drifted across the water like a warning or a promise. And I knew the next move wasn't mine. It was hers. But when it came, I would answer it, with truth sharp enough to cut through anything she brought forward. The night deepened. The lake listened, and I waited for what tomorrow would bring. Morning arrived without fanfare. No wind, no birdsong, just a soft gray haze settling over the valley, like the land itself was bracing for something final. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug that had long gone cold, watching the mist curl along the surface of the water. It carried the shape of the mountains on its back, drifting with the slow patience of something ancient. Even before I saw the first car on the ridge road, I knew the day had come when lies would meet their end. By 9 o'clock, the gravel pull-off near the old courthouse was already filling. Ranch trucks, HOA SUVs, county sedans, they lined the road in uneven rows, engines ticking as they cooled. Folks gathered in small clusters, murmuring in that low, uncertain tone used when a community doesn't know whether it's attending a trial or a reckoning. I walked past them quietly. No one stopped me. Some nodded. Some stepped aside. And some, the ones who'd stood proudly behind Bethany for years, simply stared at the ground as I passed. Inside, the courthouse smelled of pine polish and old paper, the same smell it carried the day I filed my first land deed decades ago. Today it felt heavier, as though every case ever heard within its walls leaned forward to watch this one unfold. The judge, Harold Provence, a man with a beard like winter frost and a stare that had softened only with age, took his seat with slow authority. "Let's begin," he said, voice settling over the room like weighted cloth. Bethany sat at the front table to the right, her blazer pressed crisp, her jaw tense enough to crack. Beside her, 3 HOA board members shuffled binders stacked with color-coded tabs that meant nothing and everything at the same time. On my side sat Sarah, calm as a mountain shadow, flipping through her papers with the deliberate elegance of someone sharpening a blade. The clerk read the accusations first, Bethany's petition, her claims, her timeline. The words echoed across the room: harassment, obstruction, community destabilization. Each accusation heavier than the last. When the reading ended, Bethany rose with a smooth, practiced posture. "Your Honor," she began, voice bright and tight like polished brass. "This community is in crisis. This man has built fences meant to intimidate, constructed barriers across shared paths, and interfered with essential utilities." "Utilities?" Judge Provence interrupted gently, eyes narrowing. "You'll need to support that claim." Bethany lifted a sheet triumphantly. "Right here. A map indicating the northern water line running directly beneath the fenced area." The judge adjusted his glasses, scanned the page, then frowned. "This form was retired 10 years ago, and the signature on it," he tapped the bottom corner. "The clerk listed here passed away in 2014. A murmur rippled through the room. Somewhere behind me, a man whispered, "Lord help her." Bethany swallowed, but didn't back down. "She prepared this form before her retirement." Sarah rose slowly. "Your Honor, may I?" She crossed the room, heels clicking with soft finality, and placed a folder on the judge's bench. "Here are the current utility maps, certified, updated, and verified by the county. The northern line she refers to was rerouted 9 years ago. The area in question has been inactive since before the HOA existed." Judge Provence flipped through the documents. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks." Bethany's face tightened. The board members beside her shifted, uncomfortable. One cleared his throat, but said nothing. Next came the zoning dispute. Bethany's claim that my fencing and construction were unauthorized. Sarah stepped forward again, presenting the paperwork with a steady hand. "Your Honor, these permits were approved through the county, reviewed by the Environmental Department, and signed off by the State Land Office." Her voice carried through the room with quiet authority. "All dated, all certified, all long before Ms. Crowley filed her complaint." Judge Provence leaned back. "I see." It wasn't the judge's tone that rattled the room, it was the silence that followed. Thick, heavy, the kind that pressed down on a person's ribs. Even the air seemed to wait. "And now," Sarah continued, retrieving one more document, "there is the matter of easements." She laid out the survey maps, rolling lines of ink depicting boundaries, water rights, and the narrow path the HOA believed it controlled. These easements expired last spring. No renewal was filed, which means any HOA use of this land during the summer months was without legal foundation. A shock of whispers erupted. Bethany shot up again. "That's impossible. Our previous president renewed those rights every cycle." Judge Provence studied her, then turned to the clerk. "Has there been any renewal?" The clerk, a soft-spoken woman with silver hair, shuffled through records. "No, Your Honor, nothing filed in the last 2 years." Bethany tried again, voice rising. "Well, someone must have mishandled the paperwork. Someone—" "Ms. Crowley," Judge Provence interrupted gently. "Please sit." She sat, but not with grace. She fell into her chair as though the weight of her own words had finally caught up to her. The courtroom grew still. Finally, the judge folded his hands. "Mr. Dalton," he said, turning toward me, "please approach." I did, slowly. The wood floor creaked under my boots as I stood before the bench, the smell of old varnish filling my lungs. "You have provided documentation that is complete, consistent, and legally sound," he said. "You have shown long-term ownership predating the HOA by decades. You have shown compliance with zoning, environmental codes, and state requirements. And you have demonstrated no threat to public safety or community operations." His gaze shifted toward Bethany. "However, the HOA has submitted documents containing outdated maps, mismatched signatures, and unverifiable claims. That is deeply concerning, and it warrants a formal inquiry." A stunned quiet swept across the room. The judge lifted his gavel. "As of this moment, Maple Ridge HOA loses all authority over the lake, its paths, the marina access, and any adjoining structures. Their previous rights are dissolved pending investigation. And Ms. Crowley—" Bethany looked up, cheeks pale. You will be temporarily removed from all leadership duties while the county reviews the authenticity of the documents you submitted." The gavel struck wood with a sound that echoed through the valley. In my memory. Long after. Case closed. Or rather, truth spoken. Outside, the sky had opened into a brilliant Montana blue, the kind of blue that feels carved from crystal. People filed out quietly. Some looked ashamed, others relieved. A few approached me with tentative nods, apologies in gestures rather than words. I didn't hold it against them. People follow the wrong leader all the time. What matters is what they do once the truth steps into the light. I walked back to my truck slowly, boots scuffing along the gravel. The air smelled of sun-warmed pine and faint lake mist carried by a gentle wind. When I reached the ridge where the courthouse overlooked the valley, I paused. There, stretched below, was the lake, my lake, glittering like a dropped coin in the palm of the land. By the time I got home, the sun was lowering behind the western slope. The cabin stood quiet, steady, the way it always had. I set my hat on the hook by the door, stepped onto the porch, and let my eyes follow the last line of gold trailing across the water. The land had always known soon who owned it. Now, finally, everyone else did too. I sat in my old wooden chair, the one that creaked in just the right places, and breathed in the evening. Peace wasn't a gift. It was earned, defended, reclaimed. And today, it had come home. The lake listened, and this time it answered with silence. The good kind, the lasting kind, the kind that settles into a man's bones and tells him he has done right by the land that raised him. Sometimes standing your ground is just choosing quiet truth over loud lies. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or had to fight for what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments so I know I'm not alone out here. And if you'd like more stories about justice, land, and the people who hold fast to both, go on and subscribe. There's plenty more to tell.